Okay, so I've had a chance to give thanks to those behind this year's summit and to queue up the summit for next year, but this event isn't over yet. We're thrilled now to introduce our final session of the 2019 Future Cities Canada Summit, A Message from the Future, hosted by Dave Meslin. If you're among the 2 million or so viewers of his TED Talk, you know a little bit about Dave Meslin already. In that talk, Dave forces us to face up to our own apathy and what it's done to our public discourse and how we can reverse its corrosive effects. Dave has been a passionate political disruptor for the past 20 years, and his best-selling book, Tear Down: Rebuilding Democracy from the Ground Up, offers a roadmap for change and a cure for cynicism. Welcome to the stage, Dave Meslin.
Hey, thank you so much. Hey folks, I was hoping there'd be some music when we walked on stage. Everyone's going to be excited about that. So it's 2029. How's everyone feeling? Doesn't it feel like that time we were here in 2019 was just yesterday? Yeah. So for this session, we're going to be looking back over the last 10 years. I don't know if you all remember, but in 2019, 4 of us gathered on the stage right at the end of the 2-day summit. Mayor Lisa Helps from Victoria, Mayor Dave Aker over from the east side of Canada, from Mount Pearl, and Regional Chief Kluane Adamek. And we're coming back here for the 10-year anniversary of that session to look back and see what's happened since 2019. And of course, it's been a crazy decade, as we all know. Transformation unseen in the history of Canada, unprecedented tectonic shifts. So, I'll just share some of my personal reflections of what over the last 10 years since 2019 has really got me excited. And then we're going to bring those 3 speakers back, although one of them sent a proxy speaker, which we'll explain in a moment. So one of the most exciting changes since 2019, of course, is if you recall, 10 years ago, we had just updated the national anthem to make it gender inclusive. That was pretty cool. But finally, last year, we took out the most offensive line in the national anthem and rewrote the opening. I don't know what took us so long. Anyways, 2029, oh Canada, our home on native land. It's just more honest. And that's what we've all been saying in our heads all along. Come on. So that one's really exciting. This is an anniversary for me too, because I put out this book 10 years ago. I can't believe it's been 10 years because I still feel traumatized by the book tour as if it's right now. And what I'm really excited about is a lot of the recommendations that I mention in the book about how we can transform democracy from this hostile, polarized, dysfunctional space that turns so many people off. We can transform it into something positive and meaningful and authentic. And some of the recommendations in the book now in 2029 have actually happened, which is really exciting for me. So one, as you all know, we now have over 150 local elected borough councils to compensate for the erosion of democracy that we saw from decades of amalgamation and Doug Ford's ridiculous. Remember that in 2018 when he cut our council in half? Well, who's laughing now? Each of these borough councils has their own capital budget, participatory budgeting, youth reps, indigenous reps. They're amazing. And I don't know why it took us so long to create them. And of course, as you all know, we now have an Office of Public Lobbyists right on the main floor of City Hall, which is so cool, because when we realized that the problem isn't that we have lobbyists at City Hall, the problem is that only people with deep pockets can afford them. And now, just like we have legal aid in a court of law, we all have access to lobbyists. Every small nonprofit group, grassroots group, neighborhood association can sit down with professional lobbyists and get advice of how to move their agenda forward so there's a level playing field at City Hall. So cool, so glad we have that now. I love 2029. We've also totally reinvented our campaign finance system using the most progressive model available at the time, which is in Seattle, where they have democracy dollars. So now everyone in Toronto gets $100 worth of money, public subsidized money, and they give those 4 coupons to any candidate they want. It creates a level playing field for all citizens to contribute to the electoral process. And then, of course, we took one of the ideas in Teardown that was proposed by MP Bruce Heyer, which is to take our House of Commons, which is really the largest publicly funded daycare in Canada, and we randomized the seating. So instead of all the liberals on one side acting in mob mentality, yelling at all the conservatives on their side, we broke up the mob because it's hard to yell at someone if they're sitting right beside you and just shared their lunch with you and was talking about the hockey game. So now we have Liberals, NDP, Greens, and New Democrats all sitting side by side, and they actually talk to each other. 2029, it's the best. We've lowered the voting age finally to 16, which again was a no-brainer. Remember back in 2019, we told 16-year-olds, we think you're old enough to make important decisions about your life. You can marry your mayor, you can sleep with your mayor, you can do sexual consent at 16, but you can't vote for your mayor. That's weird. So we're like, listen, if you can sleep with them and marry them, we think you should be able to vote for them. 2029, it's so cool. Although, let me announce right here, you heard it first, I'm launching a new campaign to lower the voting age even further. So I grew up in a Jewish household, and we believe at your bar mitzvah, your bat mitzvah, you become an adult. And we also acknowledge that women mature a little earlier than men. So I think that the voting age in Canada, this is me by the way, 13, reading from the Torah, I believe that voting age in Canada should be 13 for guys and 12 for girls. Right? Let's just, come on. These are the kids who are marching out on the streets, worried about climate change. Just let them vote. Lastly, we've made all of our elections on a national holiday. It's a day off for everyone, so everyone can vote. More people can volunteer. That's a no-brainer. Half the world was already doing it in 2019, but we weren't. We've decentralized power in our legislature. So cool. So now our premiers and our prime ministers are really nothing more than ceremonial ribbon cutters. And our MPs and our MLAs have reclaimed those legislatures, and they talk to each other with meaningful, deliberative dialogue, and the executive branch is just there as makeup and icing on the cake, which is great. But not our mayors. Our mayors are still really important, of course. Municipal executive branch is totally cool. And then lastly, just a pet peeve of mine, back in 2019, our public spaces were still totally pimped out to the private sector with commercial advertising, which erodes our sense of collective belonging. And I just love what we've done in the last 10 years in Toronto. So the Astral contract for street furniture, as you all know, ended. And instead of renewing it, we've covered all of our bus shelters and our streetcars and our subways with art. It's so cool. 2029 is the best. And Dundas Square is now digital art being created by students at Ryerson, George Brown, and OCAD. All around you, you're seeing diverse art coming from actual community members who live in Toronto, rather than a bunch of commercial, heteronormative, Anglo-normative corporate crap. So that's really cool. Anyways, I just love 2029. And now we're going to bring back those 3 guests who were on this stage with me in 2019 and see what they've been doing in their parts of the country. We have a West Coast, an East Coast, and a Northwest, and we're going to cover the whole nation. So let's start with Mayor Dave Aker. He's from the city of Mount Pearl, and I should tell you, there's no mountain there, and there's no pearl. A guy named James Pearl just named it after himself. Kind of a jerk. There's a really cool video they made 10 years ago in 2019. You should check it out. It's called the Mount Pearl Anthem. and former Mayor Dave Aker drops the gavel at the end of it. It's a really fun video. When I saw you last 10 years ago, I don't even know what are you still mayor? I don't know. We're about to find out. Someone printed out all their 2029 bios, and I lost them. So I'm just going to go off of the bios I had from 10 years ago. So you were the mayor, elected in 2017 after serving 2 terms of councilor, active volunteer, avid sports fan. You would just volunteer to help out the Syrian family, bringing them to Mount Pearl. Mount Pearl, by the way, is the 2nd largest city in Newfoundland. How many, hands up if you've never heard of it. Let's just be honest. That's okay, I hadn't either. It's the 2nd biggest city in Newfoundland, just southwest of St. John's. You recently hosted a hackathon 10 years ago. You were doing really cool stuff. Come up on stage. Let's hear it from former Mayor Dave Aker from the city of Mount Pearl. Good to see you again. 10 years. You haven't changed a bit.
Thank you very much, Dave. A pleasure to see you as well. I am the former mayor of Mount Pearl, but I was also here 10 years ago in 2019. And as I look around the room, I say, you haven't changed a bit. I was proud to be part of a council that launched a digital transformation for the city of Mount Pearl. I guess I should hit the clicker once. Here we are. Good. That was back in 2019. We were a city of 23,000 people. We're now a city of 30,000 people, in part because of that digital transformation. We had 2 choices. We could sit back, we could just see what happens, or we could reinvent ourselves, plan for the future, and we chose that latter option. So it started in 2019, and it's taken 10 years to get where we are today. I am the former mayor of Mount Pearl, and I will elaborate on that in a few minutes. But, you know, we have embraced technology, but that's not what it's all about necessarily. That's it's a tool. It's about innovation, it's about mindset, it's about adapting to a changing environment, whether it's climate change or, you know, use of resources, carbon footprint. So I want you to sit back and relax as I welcome you again to 2029 in our little city, which is a suburb of St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. So here we go. So typically in my day, it starts the same way. I'm very active. I know I don't necessarily have the active body on me, but at my age, folks, I'm 70 years old now. In 2029, it's all about feeling good, not necessarily about looking good. So, oh, hello, Lisa. Kluane, how are you? I promise not to pick on you because you will have your turn. Yeah. So all homes in Mount Pearl now are smart homes, including my own, where I live with my wife. My 2 kids, one lives in Mount Pearl and the other's relocated to Victoria, BC. When I get up in the morning, I ask my smart home what the weather is going to be like, what the traffic is like in Mount Pearl, and I'm led basically, you know, I'm informed that the weather is good or bad. Typically in Mount Pearl, it's bad. Typically, you don't live out our way on the east coast of Canada where the next stop is Ireland. You don't live there for the weather. You live there because you like to live there. So all the information is available from our city through sensor technology. We've installed it everywhere. We have our own broadband network now, and that came about from a public-private partnership. So there was some public investment and some private investment to get there. Because folks, as we made the transition from 2019 to 2029, we knew we would have to invest in different ways. But that's not to say that it didn't require additional investment. So before I get ready to leave for my morning swim, I check my route, send the information off to the car from my house, and my autonomous vehicle is waiting for me in the driveway. And I'm so glad that the folks at Kitchener-Waterloo, at the University of Waterloo, when we heard about autonomous vehicles in around the time frame from 2010 to 2019, everybody in California hadn't figured out how they're going to drive all those vehicles in snow. So the Kitchener-Waterloo area in 2019 was a major testing ground for all that. But we've landed there. If you can drive an autonomous vehicle in Mount Pearl and you can navigate 4 seasons, and that would be on a Sunday, then basically you can drive an autonomous vehicle or enjoy one all year round. I was a little bit cynical about the autonomous vehicles, but now I know it's a preferred method of transportation, and it's not just for me, it's about car sharing as well. From time to time, I'm willing to share a ride with my neighbors so that we don't always use mass transit, but we're also lowering our carbon footprint. The cars are all electric, of course. So as I sit back, I'm getting ready to go on the summit. I leave my house, I'm walking out to the car, and I press the button, the remote on the car, and it won't start. It won't even open. So then I figure out, this is my morning this morning. I have to figure out, well, why can't I get in? But unfortunately, my spouse has the passcode to the car, and she wants to use it in 5 minutes. So some things, folks, never change. I gotta go back into the house, beg her for the passcode so that I can get into the car. So even though we've come 10 years, sometimes your relationships are exactly the same as they were a decade ago. So, on to the swimming pool. This is our state-of-the-art facility in Mount Pearl. It's a net zero energy building. It is the most environmentally sports facility in the country, and I love to swim. That's how I start my day, I think I told you. We've got in-pool sensors that track my calories, my number of laps, basically gives me a report card at the end of it all. We've even got a holograph, which is virtually installed in the bottom of the pool. It guides me through a routine. It tells me, by following it, what pace to swim. It's all based on past activity. It's all been machine learned based on my past swims. And if I want to up the pace, just a matter basically of going onto an app and making sure that that basically is executed on my behalf. And when I finish my swim, my data is automatically stored and ready for my next visit. Now, I swim every day with a friend of mine who has accessibility issues. So back in 2019, he would have one of those, you know what I mean by the blue permit? The accessibility permit, you park in a blue painted zone. They don't exist in 2029. If you've got an accessibility issue, your car will drop you off at the front door, and then you'll be able to go in. So we've got you to the front door. Then the car just goes parked somewhere in the background until it's ordered to come back and pick you up. So I think we've helped to solve some people's accessibility issues in that regard. So the next slide, we're going to talk about what we call the waterfront here in Mount Pearl. So after my swim, I meet up with an old friend for a morning coffee. We head to the river boardwalk, and it's along a place in, you wouldn't know our area, but we have a river called the Waterford River, which goes through the entire region and empties into St. John's Harbor. So we decided about 10 years ago to develop that as an area that was sustainable, a place where people could enjoy, but at the same time we wanted to make sure that development was environmentally friendly. So we've installed sensors all along the route there where all of the rainwater or the storm water that's coming off our streets, they're monitored for things like salt, chemicals, just to make sure what's going into the river is healthy for the environment, so our citizens can also rely on it. While I'm on the boardwalk, I see a stray dog. So when the stray dog is coming at me, I say, hang on now. I get out my app. I just text the app notifies the city of Mount Pearl that there's a stray dog. Of course, the dog's got a sensor in his or her collar. So I am a dog-friendly person. So next thing you know, our animal control people are coming to take the dog back to its rightful owner. So, you know, some things never change. There's always going to be dogs out there that go astray, but we figured out a way using technology to make them safer and get them back to their owners. So we're going on now to our little city. It's 2029. We've got an outdoor bench space. So I'm going to go there. I walk along the boardwalk to the cafe, and I'm being presented as we go along with information, whether it's in a smartwatch or it's on my glasses here. It's giving me messages, and I see Dave is telling me to hurry up. Okay, I got that, Dave. Thank you very much. But we are always being fed data that's relevant to us, and Mount Pearl's got a diversified population primarily made up of, in 2029, primarily made up of both young families and seniors. I'm part of a group, we volunteer twice a week. We're called Seniors Who Love Sensors. And we all grew up as baby boomers. We're part of the rock and roll generation. And our first exposure, by the way, to technology came out of the moon race. And our first exposure was back in the 70s, can anybody remember the Texas Instrument calculator? I see a few people nodding their heads. That was when chips were finally made available and put into production from the moon race. So, after volunteering with seniors who love sensors, I stopped into Funbox headquarters. So, back in November of 2019, Mount Pearl held the first municipal hackathon in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And it was basically to bring together people with innovative ideas, using technology to help solve some of our problems. Funbox was all about making it easier, more efficient for municipalities to attract fundings from government agencies or from private foundations. So, you know, the lucky winner, which was announced 10 years ago, was called Funbox, and now they are a vibrant startup in our community. They employ 60 people, and of course they love working in the city of Mount Pearl. And I love the fact that they're paying property taxes. I'm just going to say, they've got to pay their own way. But you know what's changed in 10 years? The focus for the hackathon that we had this year was about cybersecurity. It was about data threats, and it was about viruses, that kind of stuff. So some things never change, and it's really, really critical when you're in a driverless car that you know you have full control over it. On my way back one day from the Summit Center, I was headed back for a coffee. My car automatically went to McDonald's. And I figured out later on that's because someone was trying to use a virus to commandeer my car to go to McDonald's to pick up. They don't call it a Big Mac in 2029. It's now called the Old Mac. So moving right along, here we have our office lobby. Let's go back one. So after I leave there, I go to meet my daughter for lunch. Now, Courtney used to live in Ottawa 10 years ago, but she now lives in Mount Pearl. She's an engineer by training, and she's working with a company which she owns, developing nanomachines that pair with the immune system and fix problems with like cancerous cells or clogged arteries. And she started we have a business incubator that we established 10 years ago called the A1 Next Innovation Center. A1N is the first 3 digits of our postal code. Now, that's redundant now. In 2029, there is no mail, so there is no need for postal codes. It's all electronic. But Courtney started, I got her the job at the incubator, then there was the inquiry, and that's why I'm no longer mayor. Oops, there we go. Yeah, so we go to nearby parks now on a regular basis for picnics. And of course we can pre-order them, and of course we get basically things like Uber Eats will drop them off. We just pre-order, and it seems a bit strange to me, but you know, it's such a great device because in 2029, using devices like that means that there's not going to be a car delivering it, or I'm not necessarily going to have to drive to a restaurant so that I can, so we've lowered our carbon emission when it's all said and done. You've heard of skip the dishes. In 2029, this is called skip the dishes, skip the driver. That's where it all ends. Now we're onto the rooftop garden that we've created in our city, and what's really important to us is food security, as well as supplementing some of the nutrients that we need to see go to our local food banks. These markets have grown exponentially. They're a little bit of a takeoff in 2029. They're a takeoff from what you see happening in the craft brew industry, where basically you see a lot of micro production, and you don't see necessarily a lot of competition. You see the community working for the needs of for its members. We have a lot of these rooftop gardens, and basically they supplement the food sources within our fine city with healthy vegetables, low-cost eating options for all of our residents. And after an afternoon of volunteering and mentoring, I'm heading home for dinner, but I'm also a runner. So we have about 60 kilometers of trails in the city of Mount Pearl. We had about the same in 2019, but in 2029, all the lights on the trails are now activated by motion. They're all solar powered, and you know, despite all the technology that we've adopted, at the end of the day, we're still what we call a city within a park. So that's Mount Pearl in 2029. You know, at first when we started this journey, I wasn't sure. I was the skeptic. But I've gone to a bunch of conferences, whether they be about smart cities, or I've attended hackathons, or Future Cities has been involved with the we hosted the Atlantic Idea Camp in Mount Pearl. And I always say to people, as being the skeptic, is we didn't know at the time what the journey was going to be, but you need to throw some mud on the wall sometimes and see what sticks, because what sticks for Mount Pearl may not stick for anybody else in the rest of the country. You need to let it stick based on the needs of your residents, but there's no doubt that you're going to have to continue to be, for the next decade, to 2039, you're going to have to continue to be innovative, adopt technology, and adapt to climate change. You can't eliminate that. I want to say thank you so much for having me. Dave, you've been a great host, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you so much.
Grab it. I was trying to whisper something to him. You can't do that when there's a microphone strapped to your face. That reminded me of a story. I was in St. John's 15 years ago with a band, and I saw a postal code of A1A23 something, and I thought, is there an A1A1A1? And I just became obsessed with it until I found it. I visited someone in A1A1A1, and I have a framed copy of their utility bill with A1A1A1. None of my friends were as interested in it as I was, but I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So 10 years ago here, I met Regional Chief Kluane Adamek. I don't know what you're up to these days, but back then, 10 years ago, you had recently, within a year or two, been sworn in as the Yukon Regional Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Proud citizen of the Kluane First Nation and the Kluane clan of the killer whale. Very mixed background, German, Irish, Tlingit, and Southern Shoshone. Bilingual, French and English, the classic Canadian official bilingual languages, but also learning Southern Shoshone and Tlingit. A BA in Canadian Studies from Carleton, an MBA from Simon Fraser, founder of Our Voices, a collective of Northern Indigenous emerging leaders, and you also held national roles with your portfolio responsibilities at the AFN for climate change and the environment, modern treaties implementation, and co-chair of the Chiefs Committee on Health. Amazing. So I'm very excited to hear what you've been doing for the last 10 years. If you're wondering which part of Canada we're talking about, we've got one mayor. If my face is Canada, we're going to have Victoria and St. John's, and then the Yukon would be just kind of up here. It's almost at Alaska where you're at. You can see Alaska through your window, I think, I've been told, if not Russia. Anyways, big round of applause. Welcome back, 10 years later, Regional Chief Kluane.
Fantastic. I'm really pleased to be here. Want to thank Joe for the opportunity. There we go. We were all standing in the back, and you could feel the air, and we were all feeling like movie stars. And then we said, hey, 10 years ago, where were we? So thank you for that reminder. Danche Kluane Adamek Uye, Dakloe di Ayahat, Augeyo Haut Duasaug, Ganach Chish, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Ganach Chish, Wendat, Huron, Ganach Chish, Mississaugas of New Credit, Augeyo Haut Duasaug, Dakloe di Ayahat, Suya, Russell Dixon, Tlingit Enoch, Asiya, Agnes Johnson, Kluane Man Kai Iche, Ganach Chish, Ganach Chish. So what I shared with you is that my name is Kluane Adamek. I'm a citizen of Kluane First Nation, very small community in the Yukon. 10 years ago, we had a population of 80, and that community has grown by just 20 people, so a very small community that I come from. It's important that I share a little bit about where I come from, because as Northerners, of course, over the last 10 years, our young people have been learning their language, and so it's so important that, as is our custom, we recognize the traditional territory, we share with you the clan that we're from, Killer Whale, and I carry the name Age. That name was my great-great-great-grandmother's name, and she originally came from Alaska. So when we asked about, can we see Alaska from our window? Well, no, but if you drive 2 hours, what is now a highway that provides the opportunity for new hydroelectricity projects that have been developed since 2019, as well as partnerships which provide the opportunity for electric cars. The Yukon has come a long way. How did we do that? How did the city of Whitehorse implement the declaration on the state of climate emergency? Well, the first thing we did was engage directly with First Nations. The Yukon has 14 First Nations. 11 of those nations, it's now about 30 years since they signed their self-government agreements, those nations have the ability to determine laws on their territory through self-government agreements and through their jurisdiction with their land claim agreements. It was so different 10 years ago, but now in 2029, we're seeing nations across the country who are undertaking self-government. And we've been able to share with them, not only from governance models, but also from the ability to grow economies, to ensure that environments, as stewards of the land, our environment is protected, our waters are clean, and not just thinking about it from a 10-year approach, because that's not the way in which we think about things. We think about things decades, hundreds and hundreds of years. And so you'll see some of these photos. That's Kluane Lake. You'll see some of these photos. These are projects about 10 years ago in 2019 that started. So the Trondequichin Farm. This is a photo of Dawson City. You know, it's still a scary time for the North. I mean, we know that climate change is real. We were so happy when there was an election and Donald Trump ended his 4-year term and the first ever woman in the US was elected. And also, we're also so pleased to have the second female prime minister elected in this country, following suit of the prime minister from New Zealand to pass net carbon legislation in Canada, and I think that's important as well. So we have come a very long way. And so when we look to the city of Whitehorse, the rural and urban relationships have changed. We look to a growth in the Yukon back in and around 38,000 people in the whole territory in 2019, now at about 55,000 people. But here's what we did. We worked in partnership with communities. We recognized that clean energy was the path to the future. There's no denying that climate change is real, and there's no denying that if we didn't make change, then we were not going to see anything for our children and for our grandchildren. So these partnerships included things like wind projects. They included things like solar panels. Now when you're flying into the Yukon, over communities, but also over the city of Whitehorse, you see every single home with solar panels, because that was the way to the future. You see young people that are representing in elected positions, in leadership positions, because we know leadership isn't just being in an elected position, right? It took us some time to get that. But we see young people, young women, young men, Indigenous young women, and Indigenous young men also being elected into positions of leadership and leading by way of a Yukon that leads. Yukon has become, over the last 10 years, the model of success, which large urban centers have looked to. What does food sustainability look like? How do you adapt to this ever-changing climate that we're dealing with? What does clean transportation look like for rural communities? The Yukon has been able to partner with federal, private, territorial, and First Nation governments to ensure that traditional knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing and being were included in all solutions. Because finally people started to recognize that, wait a minute, I think that the stories and the legends that the elders have been talking about and modern science are actually able to support each other. So let's listen to that. So it took some time, but after COP25 that took place in Madrid, after the unrest in Chile happened in 2019, the world woke up. And the world looked to Northerners to be able to point them in the right direction as people who were being impacted every single day by climate action. We saw those communities where the banks were receding and elders weren't able to go fish and lost their entire camps, be able to respond to say, where should we look at building and expanding this community? We saw the city of Whitehorse becoming incredibly brave by offering entirely new transportation system and also looking at ways to partner with governments to look at offsets for those communities who were only fly-in only communities. We looked at ways to make technology more accessible. Communities still just run off broadband, right? If you've ever been to Iqaluit in Nunavut and you try to use your cell phone in 2019, if you were there and you tried to use it between about 4 and 10 o'clock at night, good luck in tweeting anything. But things have changed because now there's fiber across the country. And so services became equitable. From a technology and infrastructure perspective to a health perspective. And when we talk about infrastructure, buildings like this, net carbon, the footprint became young people being able to step forward in the path of their ancestors and working collaboratively with all other sectors to be able to create solutions. That's how things really changed. So now, 10 years later, our young people are speaking their language. We have partnerships across all levels of government. Whitehorse has become a clean, green energy city, and we haven't left our communities behind as we've been growing our city. Young people and elders are able to live in the same building because it's so important that, regardless of if you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, that the relationships with young people and those who are elderly, that those relationships are strong. We learned from Europe. We also ensure that there's food sustainability options for every single family, and that can happen in your own backyard. So it's been an amazing 10 years. There's still a long way to go, but the Yukon continues to be a Yukon that leads and has been a success story for not only Northerners, but for the rest of the country. So thank you so much, and look forward to welcoming you to the 2030 Future Cities Gathering in the Yukon. Gracias.
Last but not least, 10 years ago, I invited Mayor Lisa Helps to the stage from the city of Victoria. At the time, she had been elected in 2014 and re-elected in 2018 in a city which she described as a small powerhouse city. She was working on amazing stuff at the time, ranging from affordable housing to bike lanes. And at the time, I remember being impressed that that she was the second female mayor of Victoria. And if you remember, 10 years ago, gender balance in politics wasn't looking very good. Of all the provinces in Canada in 2019, every premier was male. That was pretty embarrassing back then. None of the party leaders were female, because if you remember when we had that summit 10 years ago, Elizabeth May had just stepped down the week before. And here in the mega city, we had never had a female mayor since our amalgamation in '97. We had a Mel and a Dave and a Rob and a John. But now we have Mayor Kristen Wong-Tam, which is really cool. And as you just mentioned, we have Prime Minister Wilson Raybould, which is really exciting. So there's a lot of really great things to be happening, but you know, Victoria was really ahead of the game back then. And I'm going to mention one thing that former Mayor Lisa Helps probably hates when people mention, but I just think it's so cool, because I think sometimes you have to let go of tradition and modernize and evolve and actually look at what's around you instead of just doing what people have been doing forever for the sake of tradition. And when former Mayor Lisa Helps was sworn in as mayor, she chose not to pledge allegiance to Queen Elizabeth in a city called Victoria. So cool, so cool. One of the many reasons why she is a hero of mine. Sadly, she's not here today because she is so cool that she said, why would you bring this retired former mayor to Toronto when who you should really hear from is younger voices? So what she's done is she sent 8 people from Victoria who 10 years ago were marching in the streets, walking out of their classrooms on Fridays. And they're going to come up to the stage now on behalf of former Mayor Helps and share what they've experienced since 2019. Please welcome these 8 voices from Victoria.
I'm Kluane. I'm Bethany. I'm Emma Jane. I'm Rebecca. I'm Elliot. I'm Grace. I'm Naima. I'm Hazel. We were among the millions of kids around the world who started striking in 2019 because we wanted our leaders and our elders to listen. This is a picture of us in the Victoria Mayor's office in the fall of 2019. The first Friday of every month before we would go out and strike, we'd meet with the mayor in her office. We'd tell her what we were up to in the coming month. She'd listen and advise as needed. She took us really seriously. We were striking because we wanted a future. We were scared that the planet was going to burn and no one was doing anything about it. And we were angry that cities were becoming places of exclusion, division, of rising inequality. We were also mad about all the polarization that seemed to stop adults from coming together to make the changes that we all knew we needed back then. Greta inspired us, for sure, but so did the needs in our own communities and our own cities around the world. We were afraid for our future, and this fear motivated us to action. And now, it's 2029, and look what our movement has achieved. We've reduced emissions globally 60% from 2019, and this wasn't due to individual action. It was from drastic changes and also some compromises. It was from holding corporations and governments accountable, and also cities have been leading the way for the last 10 years. City leaders, NGOs, civil society, people like yourselves who sat in this same room 10 years ago were willing to take risks. They were willing to experiment. City leaders and national governments read this Climate Emergency Urban Opportunity Report that was released in 2019, and they took the recommendations seriously. But the successes we've had are about way more than just reducing emissions. Our cities and towns are functioning in a way that's much better for people. Solving the climate crisis has led to livability, belonging, a stronger sense of place, and a stronger connection to each other. Neighborhood placemaking and resilience building was at the center of the transformation we accomplished together. City streets used to look like this, and now they look like this. Cities have been returned to people, and nature has been reintroduced. In 2019, we called these nature-based solutions, but now in 2029, this is just how cities look and feel. It's just how we build them. And also, it's really, really quiet. Fossil fuel burning vehicles, well, I can barely remember how to say that word, have been replaced with electric vehicles and other sustainable modes of transportation. And it's so quiet in our cities that you can hear the birds singing, even in the downtown. Just listen. We also accomplished the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is something that was very important to many of us youth climate strikers in 2019, particularly in Victoria. And we've stood in solidarity with Indigenous peoples for the last 10 years. We're still working on decolonization and reconciliation, but at least now in 2029, Indigenous nations have a nation-to-nation relationship with Canada. We've got a new kind of federalism. We call it multilateral federalism. And it's led to better outcomes for everyone. When we were teenagers, we'd vowed not to have kids until we'd solved the climate crisis and made cities livable again. And thankfully, we've done it. And look, here are our children. They're playing at a new playground, which is accessible most easily by bike path. Our children won't grow up with the kind of fear that we had in our teenage years. How did we do all of this? Because of people like you. In 2019, we quoted Dr. Seuss. Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. But you did care. You took risks. You worked together. You tried things. You didn't wait for national and provincial governments, though they did become instrumental once they had caught on to the fact that you were leading and all they needed to do was follow and resource your efforts better. With resources from senior levels of government, creative financing, capital stacking, and impact investing, and with remaking the way value is created, you scaled up and quickly in your neighborhoods, in your companies, one by one across the nation. You built the relationships of trust that were necessary to make all of this happen. As Diane Rusin from the Winnipeg Boldness Project said at the 2019 Future Cities Summit, relationships are the thing that can be scaled up anywhere. She told you that relationships build trust, and with trust, experimentation and risk is possible. You built those relationships. You built the trust that was necessary to experiment and take risks. Fundamentally, you understood what the youth from Climate Justice Toronto told you in 2019, that the future is a public good to be shared with everyone. And most importantly, you, working with us, you saved our lives and the lives of our children. Thank you so much for listening to us.
So, I've got some bad news. It's actually 2019. All those things you just heard were lies, at least so far. That beautiful red graph going down, which you had clearly drawn with MAC paint, is a lie.
I drew it with MAC paint. You're right.
Really?
Yeah, for sure.
Dundas Square is still a corporate cesspool. Jody Wilson-Raybould is not the Prime Minister. But I have good news. It's 2019, which means the next 10 years is a blank slate. We can do anything with it. We can make all those things come true and more. And what I'd like to do for the next 20 minutes is turn the conversation towards what role everyone in the room here could play between now and 29 through your perspective as a regional chief, as mayors. We often celebrify politicians and leaders and focus on what they're going to do. You have a lot of experience at this point seeing how the general population can support, can trigger, can motivate, can amplify. All these folks are going to walk out of this room and this conference today, and I want them to leave knowing that they each have a role to play in bringing those visions alive that you just described. So if you could each share from your lens as an elected leader how people outside of those corridors of power influence the changes we need to see, that would be really exciting. And this is so cool geographically that we have north, south, I'm the south guy. West, I should have had a coffee. West and east, and who wants to go first? I'll let you self-organize. Who am I to tell you who to go first?
I don't mind going first.
Go first, Dave.
Well, I live in a province right now that's got a lot of renewable energy. And I think we've had a very difficult time in our recent experience coming to terms with the cost of that. But yet on the other hand, you know, you've heard of Muskrat Falls, all that, electricity that's going to be on the market. Most Newfoundlanders and Labradorians don't need all of that. And the cost is going to be tremendous, add a tremendous burden to their pocketbook. But as policymakers, we've got to start working with our electorate to come to terms with the fact that the new ways of doing things, lowering our carbon footprint, adapting to climate change, we've got to come to terms with the fact that we've got to do it, and we can't do it at zero cost, because they're not going to want to replace all the other investments that are out there. We've got to come up with new ways of determining how we use our energy, in terms of ride sharing, in terms of transportation, food production. Transportation is a huge carbon emissioner there when it comes to getting the food from the grower to the table. My wish is that people would start to understand that it's not going to come cheaply, that they're going to have to reinvest not only as policymakers but as taxpayers. I really hope that our country comes together and creates a corridor where we have lots of power being produced, BC, lots of power being produced up north, lots of power being produced in Atlantic Canada, that somehow we can come up with distribution networks to share that, so we can all work together to lower the energy footprint and the impact that leads. Ladies, any thoughts on that in terms of, like, electricity is the way to go in the long run, I think. It's much more efficient, carbon footprint's lower, but how do we get our power to the rest of the country that needs it so that they can offset their carbon footprint?
I think there are a lot of different things that need to happen, and I think that it's so important that we start to deconstruct the systems that exist. So if we're looking at, for example, the way in which we live is a very different way post-industrial revolution. Things are very, very different, and it doesn't mean that we need to go back to a place in time where life moves slower, but it means that we need to think about sustainability differently.
Okay.
So when that comes to a governance perspective, governments are now recognizing, not all, but federally there's a call to action, right? Provinces and territories, some are making change. How do we transition that place of denial? Because when we look to some of the banks, when we look to some of the private sector, everyone has a responsibility. We can't just put it to federal or provincial and territorial officials to come up with these solutions, right? Like, that's not going to work. We've learned in the last 5 to 10 years that that doesn't work. So what does that mean then from a community perspective, from elected officials from a city, for example, to looking at teachers in schools, to looking at people who are working in the healthcare system? The thing that we are failing to recognize, and the reason that climate change, I think, becomes something that people can talk about and say, oh, it's scary, but it's easier to flip the page when you're reading the newspaper and read about something different, because it doesn't affect you just yet here in urban centers. But in the north, it affects people every single day, real time. Not being able to fish or hunt in the traditional places that you used to. Your cabin or your home literally being sunk because the permafrost has melted. Rivers in Kluane Lake, the lake has gone down by 10 feet over the last 10 years. No joke. This is real. So then how do we respond in places and spaces when people are making decisions who have no connection to what that feels like? We need to think about climate change from a health perspective. There are major health impacts that I don't think we're talking about here. And those are the things, and that becomes the space to get people who might not understand or who easily will flip the page if they're looking at the newspaper or reading through Twitter, oh, climate change isn't real, like, or, it doesn't affect me, so I don't care about it. Well, wait a minute. I think people really need to understand how it does affect them. And so when we're talking about making those changes in the future, people can see and feel that differently. Because if people don't see or feel how something impacts them, then it's a lot easier to turn that page.
So in answer to the question about what people here can do, first of all, one proviso, though that speech that I read, obviously, like, it was my words, but last Friday I do meet with the kids, the youth once a month, and I said, okay, I'm going to this conference, it's 2029, what do you want me to say? So that was what they wanted me to convey to you, and I think part of what they wanted me to convey to you is what you need to do, which is, and it was, someone pointed this out earlier today, not just listen to youth voices, but engage youth in the solutions and in the actions. That's critically important. The other thing that you can do, very practical, I'm a very practical person, I shouldn't be a politician at all, but is take 3 things that you've learned at the Future Cities Summit that you didn't know before you got here, and just go home and do them. And that's what I'm going to do. It's been such a rich conversation. I've got a notebook full of ideas. Just take 3 and just go home and do them. You can do that right away. The other thing that you can do, and I was glad to see that our MC this morning raised this, is you can love each other well. It's going to be a hard 10 years. And we're going to need to really support and love each other along the way. And so it's quite easy when it's people that feel good, they're in your circles, but the most important kind of love that we're going to need to have for each other in the next 10 years is a love that comes from generosity when we're engaging with people who don't believe, who don't want to change. And it's really easy to just dismiss them and go on with our day or with our agenda, but that's when love is going to be the most important in the next 10 years. So that's what I would say if I was asked. So thank you for asking, Dave.
So just one last piece. I think the question that we were asked to come up here in terms of where do you see things in 2029, in addition to what can you do, my question would be to start to pose that question to other people. Where do you actually see things moving, and how do you see yourself, as you mentioned, being part of that change, whatever that may look like?
So let me ask you a question now that's more specific and technical. So a lot of us unelected folks, we often are in the position of being an advocate, and we're trying to convince those in power to vote in favor of a certain initiative or against an initiative. People probably try to reach you all the time through different forms and formats, petitions, letters, meetings, protests. What's effective? Which messages actually reach you? And which messenger models turn you off? Because we have to make these decisions all the time. Do we go out on the streets and yell? Do we sign a petition? Do we have to run for office? Do we have to beg? Do we have to hire a lobbyist? How do we influence you?
Well, I don't know, Victoria might be a bit of a unique situation, I'm not sure, but we were starting a Climate Champions program in January, and we invited a small group of people one Saturday who are kind of unlikely suspects, in addition to the youth climate strikers and others, faith leaders, kind of unanticipated people who are already taking climate action. And one of the women, she had just moved here from Ottawa, or moved to Victoria from Ottawa, and she said, okay, what do you need us to advocate about? And again, this might just be unique to Victoria, but I suspect that it might not be. And what I said is we don't need any more advocacy. We're convinced what we need now is for you to roll up your sleeves and work alongside us to implement the solutions. We need you to help your neighbors remove their oil tanks. We need you to help your neighbors retrofit their homes. We need you to encourage people. If someone doesn't know how to take transit, show them. So in Victoria, we don't need more advocacy. What we need, and I think this is hopefully really empowering for our residents, we need people to roll up their sleeves and work alongside us. Having said that, more generally, for me, what resonates as an elected official and also as a human being is when people don't scream and yell, but when they say, hey, I understand you're working on this, How can I help? Or I understand you're working on this. I really disagree with the approach that you're taking. How about this? So screaming and yelling doesn't really resonate that well. Having a rational conversation about differences of opinion really does. So that's what works from my perspective.
Certainly, and what I think many are kind of defining now as like a heart-centered approach to leadership, I think is really important. So again, understanding and being able to be compassionate in a way that you're bringing up an issue. That for me is really important because it's really easy to approach things when you're angry, than to take the sleep test and then look at a way in which you would approach something. And I try to practice this myself, and so that I think is really important. Now, at the same time, I know that there are real feelings in community where there are protests that aren't that way. There are people who block roads because their rights are being dishonored and not respected. And so that is something that we have to also acknowledge. So what does the path forward look like? For myself, I think it's so important. I want to know when people's voices aren't at the table, and something that I've always been raised with is to acknowledge who is and isn't in the room. So in this space, which may be seen as a very privileged space, we think about who is and isn't in the room. And before getting to the place where people are angry or upset, I think as leaders it's important to consider who is and isn't in the room when we are making those decisions, so that we're able to look at I don't think prevention is necessarily the right word, but let's look at efficiency. We're talking about youth, and the youth aren't in the room, that doesn't make sense. We're talking about solutions for a particular issue that's impacting Indigenous peoples, and they aren't in the room, that doesn't make sense. We're talking about women, and women aren't in the room, that doesn't make sense. So how do we start to think about when we're advancing with solutions with respect to government or being in an elected position or whatever that looks like, who is and isn't in the room, so that we can then navigate through the output of that in the best way possible. I encourage people to reach me through social media, really active on social media. I have an opportunity in our office. We do Q&A calls with the regional chief, so people can phone in and ask questions. And some might say, oh, are you a little nervous about that, Kluane? Like, things could come at you. Well, why not? Right? Like, why not? So that propels people to also approach those spaces in a respectful way. Because if I'm opening the door and I'm very clear about the boundaries in which I'm opening that door and how I plan to engage, then my expectation is that that is reciprocated on the other side.
Yeah, from my perspective, to take a little practical tone, it's all about activism being translated into political activism and then political action. But I would say we need you and your perspective at the table. And the only way you're going to get to the table is you have to couple what people's current needs are with some of the goals, the long-term visions, because generally speaking, unfortunately, people don't necessarily think down the road. We need to get people at the table that are thinking about the future. Typically for many of us politicians, it's a year at a time, it's 4 years at a time. It's the wrong way of thinking. In my experience, there's such a focus in the private sector and in the public sector on growth. And ultimately, the planet will never be sustainable if we just keep growing. We've got to change our ways. We've got to get more people with those mindsets at the table. The practical part is getting them to the table. Getting elected is not easy. It's a huge sacrifice for people that decide to come to the table. My only advice to people would be is if you want to get involved, yes, roll up your sleeves. The younger you are, the better. It's going to be a big sacrifice, but make sure you couple your activist ambitions with what the people currently need as well. So if you couple them together, I think you can make change. And I'm not sure what the pace of the change will be, but that's the voice, Dave, we need around the table.
All right. Go ahead.
I think one thing that I've heard a young person shared with me was that, is there a difference, Kluane, between being a politician and a leader? And I think there is. The mayor described, I don't think I'm a politician, but I'm this. Leadership is about showing up, right? And our elders say half of everything you do, Kluane, is just to show up. Because if you show up, then you're there. And when you show up, that means you're listening. And when you show up, that means you're open. And when you show up, it means. So I think that's the thing, is there is a difference between being a politician and a leader, but if you continue to show up as a leader, then you may then have those opportunities to show up as being an elected official. And I think that that's important, and I think that that is a very different mindset that we're seeing now amongst perhaps my generation or the generation before mine, that it has to be about leadership and it has to be about showing up.
Our view has always been if you take care of the right things with a long-term plan or perspective, the politics will take care of itself. I don't think I can say that with 100% confidence, but generally speaking, if you do the right thing, the politics will naturally take care of itself. If you speak to the truth that your residents represent, the politics will take care of itself.
Let's do one really quick lightning round, just because 2 weeks ago we heard a lot about how Canada is very divisive and regional, and how do we bring Canada together, and here we have 3 reps from literally the 3 corners. Just do a quick pitch. What's really special about your part of the country, west, north, and east, and a little tourist pitch? Come visit us, because 30 seconds.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
Come visit us because we will have the best bike network in the country.
Come visit us because the Yukon and the way that it looks now may be very different tomorrow. Come visit us because we have 14 Yukon First Nations with proud cultures, and we are a proud people that are always willing and always open to hosting you in the best way that we can.
I would say come visit us if you like active living, if you like family lifestyle. Come visit us because nearby you can see whales and icebergs. And when you come visit us to see the icebergs, don't necessarily marvel just at their beauty. Remember, if you see icebergs off Newfoundland and Labrador, that's because they're breaking off in Greenland. So come experience the beauty of the icebergs, but also come experience it's a reminder about the climate change issues we